in collaboration with the Cyprus Mail. This is the Cyprus News Digest with Rosie Charalambous.
Coming up on the programme this week, we'll look in depth at the recent EU elections.
He will be the different politician in Brussels, and he will be watched very carefully, both by his supporters, but in particular by the opponents, waiting for flips, waiting for opportunities to score domestic points by hitting Akel hard, by saying, this is the guy you brought in the parliament, and look what he's doing.
Hear about a café scientifique where you can air your views on the environment.
Cyprus is one of the highest pesticide users per capita in Europe, and of course that is also killing the bees, and this is a Europe-wide problem, but it's a problem also in Cyprus.
And President Anastasiades addressed the guests earlier this week at the British High Commission as they celebrated the Queen's birthday.
It is not, of course, my intention to refer further to the tensions within our exclusive economic zone, but it is a situation that regrettably deters our efforts to resume negotiations on the Cyprus problem.
Well, the dust has finally settled on our European elections, and we're joined this week for a look back at what came out of them by the Professor of History and Political Science at the University of Nicosia, Hubert Faustmann. Now, Hubert, two things struck me immediately. One is, I think we're the only European country with no women MEPs, and of course the big news here was the fact that Niyazi Kuzulurek got elected for Akel, first ever Turkish Cypriot to be elected as an MEP. So let's start with those two things, and then we can perhaps look more broadly at the rise of fascism and all the other things that we've noticed in this election.
I agree. I mean, Cyprus has no tradition of voting women into high offices. There are notable exceptions, like Mrs. Vassiliadou, who were EU commissioner. So on a European level, actually, Cyprus is doing much better than it does on a national level, where usually maximum one ministry, if you're lucky, two ministries, and very rarely one of the key ministries, go to women. So it's more of the same. The strongest candidates for the elections were male. Yeah, there were female candidates. Eleni Chiohaus was one of the women tipped will have a chance to get re-elected to Parliament. She was there, so Cyprus had a woman in the European Parliament. But she failed also for party political reasons, siding with Diko, and that I think voters didn't take that well or well enough to vote for her.
Well, it looked fairly obvious that she was just jumping on whichever ticket she thought might actually get her back to the...
That's what I wanted to say in kinder words. Yeah, so I think this act of political opportunism was not rewarded by the electorate of Diko, also opted for one of their own. And since they have a tradition of getting one candidate in, and that was the hottest candidate for a seat, from a gender perspective, as far as I could see. So it's regrettable in that sense. It's definitely a good development that the Turkish Cypriot got elected. I think the symbolic value of that decision should not be underestimated. The problems that come with it should not be underestimated either.
Like what?
One, which is not a problem, but a feature of it, is of course the criticism from those circles who do not want to address that the Republic of Cyprus is represented by a Turkish Cypriot, for the reasons we both know well enough.
But for people listening who don't know, just outline them for us, because Niyazi was actually pilloried both in the north and in the south by the far right, and in some cases the far left.
Yes, I mean, he became entangled in the long history of the Cyprus dispute that, as far as elections is concerned, meant that since the breakdown of the constitutional order in 1963, you did not have a single elected Turkish Cypriot representative within the institutions of a purely Greek Cypriot-dominated Republic of Cyprus. So in that sense, it's a historical event that you have a Turkish Cypriot representing the Republic of Cyprus, but also representing the Turkish Cypriot community, which within the institutions of the Republic had no voice anymore since 1963.
But he's made it very clear that he thinks the most important thing about his election is the message that it sends that he was voted in by both Greek Cypriot and Turkish Cypriot voters. And we'll talk a bit later perhaps about the poor turnout of the Turkish Cypriots and the problems some of them faced at the polling stations. But it's not so much the fact that he is a Turkish Cypriot. We see that possibly in one sense, and Europe will undoubtedly see it in another sense. But could it also kickstart, if you like, Europe's idea that possibly after all there is hope to solve the Cyprus problem?
I think that would be a misperception and overstating it. I don't think this signifies a massive change towards a settlement of the Cyprus problem. There are forces and dynamics at place that work against a settlement that are much more forceful than a symbolic victory of a Turkish Cypriot running in elections. That would be overstating the significance. But him speaking in Turkish in the European Parliament, in that sense, I mean, he will try to represent all of Cyprus, both communities. He sees himself, and he has a reputation as a unifying figure in favor of a bicommunal federation and the reunification of the island. And he has very moderate views on the Cyprus problem. He speaks Greek, he speaks Turkish. So on a symbolic level and representing a different voice in the European Parliament, that's probably what he can bring along. But anything else a single parliamentarian can probably not do. To me, it's interesting is Akel's commitment to say we will also, in the future, have Turkish Cypriot candidates, which is a break with the tradition of the past. And to me, that's interesting if this will backfire or will be rewarded on the party. And a lot will also depend on his performance in the parliament, because he's not an Akel man. And once you start saying things Akel might not be very happy about, this is when things get interesting.
And I think I'm right in saying that a lot of voters here don't really understand when they're voting for an MEP what that job entails, because they think more in small Cypriot party terms. So just outline, if you will, the role of an MEP who's representing, yes, the whole of Cyprus, but joining the blocs in the European Parliament.
The European-wide politics are made there. So if you look at the press, it was sold as an insignificant election, inconsequential, which is not completely true, since the powers of the European Parliament have increased. They will have a big voice now in the election of the head of the Commission, which is the big job to be given, and there was a debate if the strongest candidate should get it or not, or at least it will need the support of the European Parliament. But it's involved in European policy making. It's European issues, which is particularly difficult to digest for a country like Cyprus that has a reputation, rightly so, of being a one policy state and being obsessed with the Cyprus problem and seeing everything through the prism of the Cyprus problem. And the debate we had so far is very much a reflection on this. We talk about ethnicity and the Cyprus problem background to these elections, rather than the agenda these parliamentarians can have.
And there was very little in the manifestos and the discussions on TV and so on about European policy.
This is a tragedy of Cyprus, but it's part of an underdeveloped political discourse on the island that's about anything else but the Cyprus problem, and maybe some local issues like now Gezi, the health system, that makes it into the public realm and is debated in a more sophisticated way. Everything else takes a long distance, second, third, or fourth in the politics of the island. It's a very parochial way. I mean, in most countries, European elections have a strong national dimension, but they have a European dimension. And in Cyprus, this falls far short of the minimum expectations you would have, including the candidates. Also, Niazikis Yerik is not a known expert on Europe or European politics. He's not elected because of his expertise, he's elected because of his ethnic background and what he symbolizes. But that is not better or worse than probably the other candidates are. So within the politics of Cyprus, this election makes sense, but it's tragic in particular if you look at the wider picture and the situation the European Union is now, which is a historical crossroads, not just because of Brexit, but because of the rise of left and right-wing populist parties and the new composition of the European Parliament, with a significant bloc coming from the xenophobic political rights and the traditional conservative and socialist, social democratic wings being not strong enough anymore, even to form a great coalition and dominate the parliament. So we have a more fragmented parliament at a vital time of history for the European Union, and it's tragic if this institution that is so important for Cyprus, also from a Cyprus problem perspective, is so little understood and appreciated in public discourse in its other dimensions.
Talking about the rise of populist parties, particularly the far right, let's look at the votes that Elam, for example, got here. What do you make of that? There was a rise, they didn't get an MEP, and people said, well, they lost, but they didn't lose actually, they gained a lot of votes.
They gained a lot of votes, which was expected. The secret winner of the elections is EDEC, because without Elam they would have had by far worse results. So that they could defend their seat, they largely owe to the rise of the xenophobic right. So there's an irony for a historically left political party that the rise of the political right protected something that probably would have been gone otherwise. But Elam is, in a sense, the only real protest party of significance you have. So if you take a wider European pictures where voters who are disgruntled with the political system or developments like the migration wave or whatever rush and give left and right-wing parties huge increases in votes. In Cyprus, this is still, so you're at 8%, at a lower level that you would observe it in other European countries. And the protest vote in Cyprus is rather an abstention vote. So it was probably amongst the best possible outcome feasible in the circumstances. Elam has the dynamics going for themselves as the only true protest party embodying certain things and the widespread dissatisfaction with the system, which otherwise has no means to articulate itself but through abstention at the election. And abstention again strengthens extremist parties. So Elam benefits from that form of protest as well because it increases relative share in votes if mainstream voters stop going to
and
the polls.
they also took quite a few votes, I think, from the big parties, didn't they?
Yes, DC fielded a candidate explicitly designed to take votes away from Elam. So a European-wide phenomenon that right-wing xenophobic parties can impose their agenda on the mainstream parties, shifting them in their direction, but then not convincing people to go for the fake thing instead of the real thing.
And was that a bad move on DC's part? Because I think it alienated some of their more moderate supporters.
You would have to look into an in-depth analysis if they gained more or lost more. I haven't seen that, but my hunch is they lost more than they gained. So they again see themselves as the winner of the elections. They remained the strongest party. I don't think they were regretting too much.
But they lost share, didn't they?
They lost share, yeah, which for an incumbent party is often not uncommon. And there's a lot of dissatisfaction with DC going on that has nothing to do with Elam. Yes. Some people are unhappy about the handling of the Cyprus problem, so it's the dominating issue, which in a polarized party like DC that is in one half a more hardline party, in the other one half a more solution party. This party is under permanent tension anyway between its extremes within the party. So you have to play both sides to some degree, but I wouldn't attribute the vote loss just to the fielding of the Elam candidate. There's more at stake, in particular of a country, as we said earlier, that's so dominated by the Cyprus problem.
Now, you talked about abstentions. The turnout across the island, I think, was lower than it has been in the past. People may have gone to the beach, the weather was nice as I recall, but at the same time it does show almost a total lack of interest. Do you think it really is that people can't be bothered because they don't understand what's going on, or that they were actually trying to say, I don't like any of the candidates, this is my message to you, I'm not going to vote? Because very often people who abstain don't realise the impact their abstention has on the overall results, do they?
It's both. To me it's interesting that it's counter to the European trend. In Europe, the voting rate has gone up, significantly up. So a lot of European electorates understood that this is not the inconsequential, unimportant election, but really that Europe is at crossroads and it needs a strengthened institution and a commitment of its citizens, also by voting towards that institution. In Cyprus, I think that message got lost for the reasons we discussed earlier. From a Cyprus problem point of view, there's nothing going on. Niazi was a polarizing issue that brought some people to the polls. There was a strong motivation either to rent a Turkish Cypriot from getting elected or to get a Turkish Cypriot elected. So that was an additional incentive which we didn't have in the past, in the sense that before there was not a real chance of a Turkish Cypriot becoming elected. Now it was. So you had one push factor towards elections. But then this narrative of European elections being not important, so they have low turnouts European-wide, but as I said, the European trend was the opposite from Cyprus. Good weather and apathy and frustrations always. The abstention rate in Cypriot elections go up consistently for years now. And it's usually attributed in important elections like presidential elections to the disgust a lot of citizens have with their political elite. It's definitely both. It would be difficult. You would need more detailed polling to find out which of these two factors contributed to it. But it's a sign that if the rest of Europe increasingly goes to the vote and Cypriots do less, it's something you should think about more carefully than it's maybe done in public discourse.
Now, what do you make of the Turkish Cypriot turnout and the reports that we heard that at some polling stations people went along there and then were denied the right to vote because some documentation they were told wasn't in order, or so on and so forth. That created a little bit of anger, I think we could say, among those people who were turned away, but generally speaking, it was a poor turnout from the Turkish Cypriots as well.
Yes, they're torn electorate as well. I mean, their national narrative is, we are not part of the Republic of Cyprus, these are not our elections, these are not our representatives, don't go. So significant parts of the public frown upon those elections. Then there are more reunification-prone Turkish Cypriots, which is a large part of the population who have their problems with the Republic of Cyprus but see the significance. Then you had these technical problems. There were actually concerns that if they all turn up, the infrastructure would not be sufficient for allowing them to cross. I think this was dealt with. The issue with the irregularity is something I can't really judge because I haven't looked at it into details. We know that it was a massive problem last time, which led to complaints, and I think the Republic of Cyprus was sensitive enough to say we don't want the same headlines that we had the last time, this time. So it beats me to what extent this was affected, how big the numbers were, and how justified the concerns were, because it was with name inconsistencies and registrations. These are like bureaucratic procedures. And as long as we can't prove malign intent to disenfranchise a significant number of Turkish Cypriots, that's why the percentages is interesting. Yeah? And that I lack the knowledge to really judge, so I would refrain from any public comment on this because I don't know enough to see if this was a policy, which I doubt, or more administrative, bureaucratic reasons. So we have to look at the extent of it. Of course it needs to be minimized, and it's good to have even less the next time, but it's not the phenomenon we had last time, where most Turkish Cypriots got disenfranchised through bureaucratic means. Yeah.
Finally, do you think that the current composition we have of MEPs in Brussels will in any way energise voters next time round, or will we have forgotten it by then?
A lot will depend on Niazi, because he's the person who will be watched. Yeah, usually you forget about it and they do their Cyprus problem resolutions and then report home what backbench successes they had, but it's an insignificant group within the European Parliament. We talk about 6 MEPs. So they cannot rock the boat too much, but he will be the different politician in Brussels, and he will be watched very carefully, both by his supporters, but in particular by the opponents, waiting for flips, waiting for opportunities to score domestic points by hitting Akel hard, by saying, this is the guy you brought in the parliament, and look what he's doing. That we will have. So to me, anything else stayed very much the same. If you look at the candidates there, okay, the TV presenter was there, which is another form of kind of, is it a protest vote, but it's not the established politician going for a media face. But for me, Niazi is the person that will be watched, and who will make it to the news regularly with what he does in Brussels, simply because I don't expect the other 5 to have any spectacular successes given the size. Yeah?
It's not just the size, though, is it? I mean, you can very easily access through the European Union's websites who has done what. And I wonder again, before people go to the polling stations, do they actually check, for example, with the incumbent MEPs to see how often they attended, what they actually did? Because, let's face it, if you do that, you find that quite a few of them do very little indeed. 1 or 2 really do pull their weight.
Yes, but you can rely on the electorate not doing this. How many people, with the exception of journalists investigating this, how many citizens really do take the opportunity to hold politicians accountable by checking on the transparency procedures of the European Parliament? I can only encourage citizens to do it, but I don't think this will be decisive. Yeah? It's party politics, voting for the party you have always voted for. That was the common understanding. We live in a clientelistic society where people need to be attached to parties for the well-being of their families and their promotions and their jobs and the favors they need from the system. So the system structure is extremely powerful in keeping people loyal to parties. And one lesson was that the big parties still pull their voters, and very few abandon their parties, even when the elections are not seen as significant. So the system is very stable for me, also mainly for clientelistic reasons, and for reasons that people don't feel they have a real alternative that would be different.
Plus ça change, as they say. It'll stay the same probably for many years to come. Hubert Faustmann, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you, Rosie.
On Monday, the Cyprus Institute is hosting a café scientifique, which means that if you have an opinion on World Environment Day, and particularly on this year's topic, which is air pollution, then you should perhaps go along. Joining us to tell us all about it is Nicolas Jarot. Nicolas, the idea behind this, who can go, and what do you expect of them?
The whole concept of Café Scientifique, which was actually invented in the UK despite its name, is really to get the public to participate and to debate issues that matter to them. So it's open to everyone. It's going to happen in the evening at 7 o'clock on this coming Monday. And the subject is the subject of this year's World Environment Day, which is air pollution. So we'll have two very short presentations about pollution and why it matters to society in Cyprus. I think we all know that it matters here. And then we'll encourage people to debate and discuss how it impacts their lives and what we can do about it.
Well, what can we do about, for example, the Saharan dust that is coming over in increasing quantities for many more days of the year? There's nothing we can do about that, is there?
There's nothing we can do except we can help to forecast it better, and that's what the Cyprus Institute is busy doing. We try to forecast these dust events and to warn people so that, for example, schools can keep the kids indoors, parents can keep their kids safe. So at the very least, we can't stop the dust from coming, but we can actually get ready for it.
And one of the things I notice is that in many areas of the world, it's common, for example in Asia, to see people with those masks that reduce the particle intake, and yet here they really haven't caught on, have they?
Actually, technically, schools are supposed to, I think, give these masks out when there's a serious dust episode. So I think in the future, unfortunately, we're going to see more and more of people wearing masks.
But should they be donated by the government to the schools and issued as part of the curriculum?
Well, it would be nice, and also awareness, I think, about not being outside or not playing outside when there's a dust warning. And unfortunately, the next generation will have to deal with this more and more.
So, apart from the air pollution from dust, there are other pollutants out there. I'm looking at the emissions from vehicles and so on and so forth. What can be done about that?
Well, vehicles is quite simple. Cyprus is a very, very small country, and it probably, if it wanted to, could be one of the first countries to go fully electric with vehicles.
How would it do that? Come on. I mean, people here have distance travel, and at the moment the range of most electric vehicles wouldn't actually take you to Paphos and back.
The key here is fast charging vehicles. Cyprus being a small country, you could actually, especially if it's your second car, for example, for a start, you could easily use it as your city car and never run out of juice before you can get home. But I think a lot of the new generation of electric cars are focusing on fast charge, which really is the key.
And the other key, of course, is infrastructure, because if there aren't the charging points, then it doesn't matter how fast you charge.
Exactly. But Cyprus is so small. This is such an opportunity. For once, our small size is actually an asset, and we should try and leverage that.
So what other things do you think will come up when you discuss air pollution in particular? And what other things, if we look more generally at World Environment Day, should we be looking at? We do seem here to have finally started to embrace the no single-use plastic issue, but we're not there yet, are we?
We're not quite there yet. The problem with air pollution, of course, is you can't see it. Plastic you can. So I think maybe there will be a focus during our discussion. It won't be just about air pollution. There will also be a quick talk about pollution generally and how it affects society. And plastic, of course, will point the finger at plastic, let's say, as one of the culprits, and hopefully stimulate people to think of innovative ways to deal with this.
You don't have to be that innovative, do you, to deal with cutting out single-use plastics? There are so many alternatives available now if you're willing to make the effort.
It's not that difficult. We've seen it in Cyprus. We've seen a change in the supermarkets. They now charge for the bags. That is a progress. But I've seen innovations in countries which have far less economic buying power than the Cypriot consumers, and they've come up with much more innovative solutions. For example, wrapping products in supermarkets in banana leaves or in biodegradable alternatives. So I think there's a lot more we can do.
And Vietnam, I think, this week introduced straws made out of grass.
Well, exactly. I mean, there are so many opportunities, and I still see way too many people here drinking with their plastic straws. So I hope that our debate can play a small role in stimulating a bit of thinking about all these problems.
Because, of course, there are also steel straws that you can use forever and other alternatives to almost everything we do that harms the environment. Let's talk, if we may, very briefly, because I know you're a mushroom man and mycologist, and you talk about the impact that can have on our environment, but also let's talk about bees. So those two issues, how do they fit into this whole thing of World Environment Day?
Well, again, Cyprus is one of the highest pesticide users per capita in Europe, and of course that is also killing the bees, and this is a Europe-wide problem, but it's a problem also in Cyprus. We're losing our bees. Even if you decide to set up an organic farm with bees on it, your neighbor won't do that, and therefore your bees could still get killed because your neighbor will have illegally sprayed their fruiting trees while they're flowering, which is actually not allowed in Cyprus. So there is a big problem here of awareness, and there's a problem, and that's a pollution problem. Pesticides are cause a form of pollution, so this is definitely a big issue. Mushrooms, of course, are a carbon sink, what you call a carbon sink. If plants are healthy, their roots will normally be associated with fungi, and those fungi capture some of the carbon that the plant gives them. So when you have a healthy soil ecosystem, we call it, with a vibrant fungal community growing in the soil, you have an extra carbon sink. You're actually capturing carbon instead of emitting it.
And so how can we put these things that you've mentioned into a widespread use in Cyprus? Do we need legislation from the Environment Ministry? How do we do it?
It's a combination of changing policy, but in many cases the policy is already there, and it's about making people aware of these policies. I'm not sure how many people who are spraying their fruit trees when they're flowering are aware that that's not allowed. So I think awareness of those policies and awareness of the impact of what people are doing is vitally important, and that's what this event will try and address.
And this event is taking place on Monday at the Cyprus Institute at 7 p.m. and it is a café scientifique you can check out on the website
worldwideweb.cyi.ac.cy.
We've been talking to Nicolas Jarod. On Tuesday this week, the British High Commission celebrated the Queen's birthday. The President of the Republic was there, and he highlighted the close ties between the UK and Cyprus, which he said were based on common values. He then moved on to the local issues which are currently dominating the headlines here.
You're all aware of the latest alarming developments within the exclusive economic zone of the Republic of Cyprus, which constitute a blatant violation of our sovereign rights and of international and EU law. I had the opportunity to discuss this critical matter several times with Prime Minister May, and I wish to express my deep appreciation for UK's full support and tangible solidarity with Cyprus, as clearly expressed in her letter dated May 26, through which she opposed Turkey's planned drilling activities and fully recognized the sovereign rights of the Republic of Cyprus to explore and exploit its natural resources. Therefore, I will not give attention for any statements contrary to the above by any UK government official which might negatively affect the joint aim of further advancing our partnership. It is not, of course, my intention to refer further to the tensions within our exclusive economic zone, but it is a situation that regrettably deters our efforts to resume negotiations on the Cyprus problem, particularly in a period when the UN Secretary General is trying to provide renewed impetus to the process following the appointment of his Special Envoy, Mrs. Jane Hall-Lutt. Our side, as I have repeatedly stated, remains strongly and truly committed to the resumption of the negotiations on the six-point framework that Mr. Guterres has set as the basis for the way forward. However, all stakeholders involved should clearly determine whether or not they have the sincere readiness to engage constructively in meaningful negotiations so as to finally establish the conditions for achieving lasting peace, allowing all Cypriots to live in a normal and independent state and closely working together for the prosperity and security of all, free from any foreign dependencies.
The President concluded by saying that although Cyprus was about to lose a close and valued partner in the EU, his government and he himself remained committed to build upon the dynamic and constantly growing relations in new areas of collaborations. Well, that about wraps up this edition of the Cyprus News Digest. Many thanks for your company. Hope you'll join me next week. Till we meet again, take care and God bless. Bye-bye now.